Cambridge Jockey Club, please. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming in. We have 10 minutes allocated for your submission and questions as well. So, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just like to thank everyone here for the time today. I take it that our submission from the Cambridge Jockey Club has been read. My name is Mark Fraser Campen, and with my brother own Checker Stud. It's a thoroughbred racing and stud farm which started over 50 years ago by my mother and father. I trained in Sydney for 15 years before coming home to take over the family farm. Over the past 17 years, I've remodelled my business from breeding to training to of late pinhooking and selling trial horses and racehorses to the overseas market, because there's been such a limited domestic market and lack of prize money. We have reduced our horse numbers from nearly 200 horses to 40 over the past 4 years, and I've been on the committee of the Waikato owners and also the Cambridge Jockey Club for the last 10 years. 6 months ago, I was asked to represent the Cambridge Jockey Club on the Greenfields, and in December last year, I started as my new role as the CEO of the Cambridge Jockey Club, where I'd like to introduce our chairman, Bruce Harvey.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for inviting us down here today and giving us this opportunity to talk on behalf of the club. I'm wearing two hats here today. Just a background, 35 years ago, my wife and I established an adjustment sales and pre-training farm called Ascot Farm. We started from scratch, and we survived 28% interest rates when we started our farm. We went through equine influenza, world recession, and many challenges, but we were able to survive. For 22 years now, I've been on the committee of the Cambridge Jockey Club, 10 years as chairman. Over this time, I've witnessed the growth of the club from 300 horses on an average of 900 horses per month working at the track. We peak at 1,200 in our busiest time. We have 100 licensed track users who use our track on a daily basis. We are 50 hectares, the Cambridge Jockey Club, and are the largest training centre in Australasia. About 20 years ago, we identified the need to increase numbers at Cambridge. Hence, we built boxes to rent for Murray Baker. This was followed by Roger James and more recently, Stephen Marsh. This has been a good investment, financial investment for the club, and has guaranteed numbers. The rent has lifted the financial position of the club and also the profile of the club. This cash flow has enabled the club to undertake the construction of the first synthetic track in New Zealand. This is not only a huge benefit to the Cambridge and our track users, but the New Zealand industry as a whole. There are over 2,000 horses trained in the Waikato. This synthetic track is to be used for training, trialling, and envisages up to 16 to 20 race meetings over the winter period. This should negate the problem of abandonments of trials and race days, and also help trainers get their horses ready for the spring and summer racing, which increases the fields and helps racing. We are, as a club, very keen on the Greenfields proposal, and the Cambridge Jockey Club, along with Waikato Racing Club and the Waipa Racing Club, have employed Price Waterhouse to do a feasibility study into the proposal of a Greenfields facility in the Waikato. This feasibility is through stage 1 and is funded by the 3 clubs. We still have some number crunching to do, and phase 2 is to be undertaken. It has been the vision of these 3 clubs of the Greenfields to build a state-of-the-art training, racing facility, which will include the wider equine community, and bring the facility up to the modern health and safety standards, animal welfare, and more importantly, educational of staff training, apprentice schools, etc. We have a huge problem in New Zealand of getting track riders, and at the moment we are relying on overseas, mainly India and other countries. So we need to be proactive in starting to train up and improve the skill standards of people in New Zealand. To build a state-of-the-art training and racing facility, which is the #1 aim, the vision to start with, we need considerable funding. Cambridge in a unique situation where we are preferred residential, where we have 50 hectares and we're worth in the vicinity potentially of 50 to 60 million. We don't need to enter into a greenfields. We can develop Cambridge more ourselves, but for the good of the racing, if it is doable and it is the best thing for New Zealand racing, we are prepared to look into this. To guarantee this state-of-the-art training, which is the vision, I believe we need a collaborative approach from clubs within the Waikato and Upper North Island to ensure this project would succeed. I believe if we can get clubs to push aside parochialism and unite for the good of the industry, then it would make more attractive for the government to invest into our industry. Stakes are a major challenge. I think you would have heard that with every submission. Stakes is very important. How we get there and how we achieve this is a challenge. But if we can increase stakes, everything else will follow for the good. Sponsorship would become, more people would want to sponsor. We get more participants, increased foal crops, retention of young trainers, jockeys, etc. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us as an industry. We are in a crisis point. I think we are very fortunate we had a Minister of Racing that identifies this, took it seriously. We're lucky the Massara report, John Massara has given his time and wanted to participate in this report. We are at, as I said, a crisis. I believe it is a crisis. And if we don't do anything, we're to blame. It starts with the clubs, I believe. We have to work together and we have to make a difference for these young people and the future of industry. Listening to some of these young people talk, it's gut-wrenching to hear people, how desperate they are. They're struggling to survive, let alone prosper. And we've got some very, very good young people in this game. We can't afford to lose them overseas. Some of the nuts and bolts on the bill are very complicated. I've read them through over and over again, and I don't feel I'm really qualified to make judgment on some of these. But I do believe as a club, we can have a big input into how we work with other clubs to go forward. I remember many years ago, we used to have district committees and I found them very invaluable. It got clubs talking and starting to problem solve a bit together. So whether we have to go back to more of that as well to get clubs working together, well and good. So look, thank you very much for your time. As I say, I think we need everyone's help in this to take our industry forward. Thank you.
Ian.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, you two, for coming down. I was on a district committee once, a long time ago. They worked. I want to ask you a question, and it relates to clauses 17 to 27 in the bill, which are the racing property related bills, and you talked a bit about property. Do you think it's possible to achieve what you want to achieve without legislation in the background to force clubs to do what they're told effectively with their property? Do you think you'll manage that by negotiation as opposed to legislation, I suppose is the question I'm asking you?
You'd like to think we could. You'd like to think that clubs can see the sense and work for the good of the industry. But at the end of the day, I do believe we have to have some legislation there that forces it if they won't. And I might get ridiculed for saying this, but I mean, if it's so obvious, we have to. And I mean, we're not saying we're taking away the clubs or their, you know, it's forcing them into doing something with their asset. And to me, it makes common sense in some areas. I wouldn't comment on every single club that's on the list because they might have a decent enough argument.
Related to your situation.
In our situation?
situation
Well, a couple of the more financial clubs hold the key, you know, and as I say, Cambridge is worth 50 to 60 million. So we can make a difference with that money. If we were worth $1 million, could we make much difference to a Greenfields? No, I don't believe we could. We'd need a lot more.
The reason I ask that is it's one very contentious piece of the bill, and it's caused a lot of submissions actually.
Very much so, and like I can see, like we just had a Gisborne and Wairau circuit down there, and their clubs do a wonderful job. They work hard to get people there. They present very good surfaces and what have you. But I could see the advantage of two clubs in a pretty close proximity, amalgamating and work together. Make a summer carnival down there where it'd be 3 days, 4 days. You got your Gisborne show, you're involved with polo, you could have polo down there, and make it an event like the Scone Week do in Scone. It's grown to a hell of a big week. You know, some of these areas could do that. And I think they could still retain their identity or still provide racing in that region, and it would work very well.
Jen?
But it'd be nice to see them voluntarily want to do that.
That's
you
my
know.
point.
Jen?
Yeah, a couple of things, and thanks for your submission. So one of them is, you know, we've heard from people, particularly in those local clubs, that the issue for them is that that idea about the viability of the interest, the industry, they feel as if they're, I guess, the strongest players in the industry at the moment, and that people are wanting to take their resources and feed them into the larger clubs who actually, because they're putting up larger stakes, are a drain on the industry as a whole.
I understand their thought behind that, and some of the clubs that, some of the venues that are proposed to close aren't training venues, so the horses aren't there in those regions. And I believe that we should be trying to centralise where the horse numbers are, where the breedings are, because it's a drain on resources. Having to send horses right down the country to race meetings when they're coming from the Waikato or right up north. If we had the facilities there, if we had the race venues more in the Waikato or up in North Island where the population of horses is, well, financially it's not such a drain on owners. The young ones, we all say that the young ones will lose that young generation of people going to those community races. The young ones go to Ellerslie now on Karaka Millions night in these twilight evenings who've got no interest in racing whatsoever, but they do a go along because it's an event and they dress up and it's a really entertaining night. And, you know, our biggest client for the last 25 years has been the Hong Kong Jockey Club. We provide, this is Ascot Farm, we prepare their horses for the international sale. You go to Happy Valley on a Wednesday night and it's just full of young business people. They're not even there betting, it's entertainment. They have music, they have wine tasting, they have all sorts, cooking, and it's an event. And I think if you can take the racing to where the population is, increase our facilities, to upgrade our facilities and make it more an event as well, you'll get the people there.
But except that this is the model that's been operating for the last so many years, right? This is the theory. This is what we've been hearing, is that's the theory. That's why all the money's gone into Ellerslie and Addington, etc. But they're not making the return, whereas some of the smaller clubs, people turn up because it's a community event, they're connected, it's part of their tradition and their history, and it plays that role in their community.
Yes,
and so people just can't get it.
Yes, they do turn up to those days in the community, but they're often once a year meetings, and that is the town they all go to that meeting. We want them to return week after week if we can make it, like they do in Sydney. You know, so how we get to this, you know.
But has
Jen's
that happened?
last question.
Yeah, but has that happened?
Has that happened?
Yeah.
In where?
In the big strategic clubs.
No, but we've got to create that. We've got to make it happen. So I believe if we can pool our assets and resorts and have have better facilities, have cheaper food, have cheaper drinks or whatever, and make it more inviting to people that they want to come along, well, then we've got a chance, you know.
Thank you very much for your submission this afternoon. We appreciate it. We're going to go to Kaipara District Council via video conference, please. Hello, Mayor Smith.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa I te Kaipara. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the Select Committee. In Kaipara District, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. I hope you're having a good day in Wellington. We've got a drought here in the north right now, but nevertheless, it's good to be able to speak today. Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Okay, we're losing you a little bit, but we'll try and crack on. If you can just go straight into your submission. Can you hear us?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me?
That's a bit better, but we'll just go straight into it. Well, hopefully it lasts.
Okay, thank you, thank you. My submission was very short. As you will have seen, it was a simple one-page submission, which is in support of the submissions that you will also have received from other Kaipara District and Dargaville related interests regarding the Dargaville Racing Club here. I'm specifically, I'll focus very simply on the focus of my submission, which is in subpart 2 of the bill regarding transfer of assets and surplus venues, clauses 21 through 27, which are on page 18 to 23 of the bill. So subpart 2, clauses 21 through 27, pages 18 to 23. Here in Kaipara District, we are particularly exercised right now regarding the notion that the Dargaville Racing Club is to be sold and that those assets of the Dargaville Racing Club, which the community has created, are dissolved into the industry somewhere else. The community here in Dargaville is completely concerned by this. Also, so that is an unacceptable position of the Dargaville community. When we look at the evidence base, the Dargaville Racing Club was not consulted in the formation of the Masara report. So as far as Kaipara District is concerned, which is the area of 1/3 of Northland, the evidence base, the Masara report, is of zero consequence and holds zero weight for the community that is here. So our community is extremely concerned with that absence of the evidence base, the fact the community has not been consulted, and the inference and very clear trajectory in the bill that the asset which has been on donated land by a family which is still in the community and a club which has been built up by its own voluntary efforts over the last, we'll call it nearly 100 years, all of those assets shall be sold and be lost forever from this community. Now, notwithstanding the ideals of trying to grow and secure the racing industry in general, I just simply put it to you that if the bill were reworded at clause 22, subsection 3 on page 19, and instead of reading the code must consider whether any action, for example, a payment, is warranted to recognise the community interest, if any, in the racing venue or venues of the racing club that are vested in the code, you could deal very simply with the Dargaville Racing Club's submission and all of the noise that you are getting from the Dargaville Racing Club by replacing several of those words with the word shall. And I'll read that back to you. So from the third word of that clause, if it were to say, the code shall recognise the community interest, if any, in the racing venue or venues of the racing club that are vested in the code. If the bill in an act were to say that, then that completely changes the tone of the rest of the subsequent clauses here relative to the transfer of assets and ownership. Because what we are saying is that the people of the Dargaville Racing Club and this community, which has never taken money from the industry in the wider sense to build the asset, this community has owned and created that asset very proudly over a nearly 100-year period in that location. And simply to say that it is ignored is extremely high-handed and very, very problematic. And for us in Kaipara District, that's unacceptable. It's based on an evidence base in the Masara report that didn't talk with these people. So it's based on a very flawed evidence model, and that to me is extremely problematic. So without going into further detail of various other clauses which would need to be amended or looked at, the whole notion of the sale of venues that are not actually owned by the industry is extremely problematic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'll be very quick because you partly answered my question, but thank you for that. You're the first person who's come to us with a solution to an issue that I don't think, if you read that, all those clauses and put them together, it's a massive task to get to the end of that.
Yes, it is.
Race was taken, but nonetheless, you provide us with a solution. So I don't really want to ask you a question now. I'm just going to thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you from me as well for your submission. I'm just wondering if you just want to describe for us the role that the racing club plays in your community.
So it's very grassroots. It's very much it's not what you call a hard and fast track. It's a very soft grass track. And for the Dargaville community and the Kaipara community, when it was hosting racing events in Dargaville, they were very much the kind of the opportunity for the community to come together, community well-being. There was excitement. People would actually have fun, and so on and so on. And so in a poor, if you like, poorer parts of the country, you know, where social deprivation in Northland is among the highest deprivation statistics in all of New Zealand, we need to be really mindful of the opportunity of building social well-being. And some people might say, well, going to the horse races is not social well-being, you know, because it implies gambling, it implies many, many things. And quite simply, I say there is an important opportunity, and it's part of the fabric of communities such as Dargaville and Kaipara District, that these race courses and the opportunity for that fun in these places is important.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Yeah, sure. So look, I just wanted to follow up as well in terms of that aspect around the potential rationalisation of assets and your view on what might happen then if Dargaville no longer raced and there was no longer the facilities there in terms of the wider impact on the industry within that broader community. Would the current owners, trainers still participate in the industry, do you think? Would they travel to the Ruakaka or would they exit the industry? Have you got any feedback on that?
Yeah, so I would expect absolutely everyone would from the industry perspective, they would be involved in Ruakaka. I believe that the model is talking about consolidated Ruakaka. The Ruakaka is in a different district from Kaipara. And for us, Kaipara district is the fastest growing district, according to census information, in the North Island. And so we have a fast growing population and a changing community. And so the industry would relocate to somewhere else. If you like, that's one piece of the story. The key piece of the story for me regarding the notion of the asset of the community, being the value of that.
Okay, thank you very much for your time and your submission this afternoon. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you for your time and good your work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What we're going to do now is clear the room, please. We're just going to go into private for a few minutes. Thank you. He's last anyway, so it goes over.
Never mind. It's all right, I won't come up.
Thank you very much. Can we have Ashoka Pandi, please? Yes. So, but before you start to reading through your written submission, because there's a number of allegations in there, due to natural justice, we cannot accept that written submission as it is. What we're going to do is give you an option to rewrite that submission and resubmit that, and then we'll accept that at that point. In saying that, when you're giving your oral submission today, you can't refer to any accusations or anything that's in that written report as it stands. So we'll give you the opportunity to give an oral submission today, but you cannot be making any accusations or anything of the like that was in your written submission.
Does that apply to aspects of my own personal experience within the industry,
yes,
as an industry participant?
You cannot make any accusations. So feel free to make the oral submission on the bill. You're free to do that, but I will stop you if you do make any accusations of that nature. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So we've got 5 minutes for your submission.
The reason I made a submission to the Masara report initially was because it is my considered opinion, given my involvement in the racing industry, that the information that comes out of the people delegated to provide information about what's actually happening in the industry is highly misleading and leads to false perceptions as to how the industry is operated and how it works. The industry has been run by what could be termed an old boys network, which is not necessarily made up of only males, for a very long time. Clubs have had a reputation, especially the major clubs, of being status symbols. And as such, the running of the racing industry has become more and more insular and catered more and more to the perceived interest of a very narrow focus group. In particular, the group that focuses on breeding, and this is particularly prevalent in the thoroughbred breeding industry. For example, we're talking about an industry that is financially decrepit at the moment, yet last Saturday we ran a race for $1 million, the New Zealand Derby. One could legitimately ask, how does an industry in such a parlous state fund one race of that value, with that money going to one set of connections instead of the money being spread amongst a number of races, which would benefit a wider range of industry participants and therefore better aid the stability of the racing industry. The problem with the racing industry is really around the reason why stakes are maintained at an artificially high level for a certain number of races. That level of stakes is required to basically fund the interest of the major thoroughbred breeders and to a lesser extent the major standardbred breeders, to provide an incentive for people to pay outrageous, in some people's view, prices for recently bred horses. The stake structure in the racing industry has no bearing on the reality of the industry at all. And if the industry is going to be restructured, it needs to be restructured in a manner that allows the industry to be self-sustaining. The current management of the racing industry have run down the industry reserves, suiting their agenda until there are no reserves left. They've tried every trick in the book to get more money into the thoroughbred racing industry by asking greyhounds and standardbreds to take a lower percentage of the returns from racing than they were actually entitled to under the agreements they had. None of that's worked. So it seems as a last resort, they're coming to the legislators looking for a new way to legalise theft and further continue their plundering of the industry in their own interests. And I don't see anything in this bill that addresses that situation. There have been all sorts of strange goings on in the management of the industry, none of which ever get discussed anywhere and don't appear to be reported anywhere, and certainly not to Parliament. The issue of the salaries paid by the New Zealand Racing Board is a case in point. it is accepted that the salaries paid in New Zealand to people involved in the management of the racing industry are extraordinary. They are far too high by international standards. Now, the salaries appeared to be gazumped after Endre Brown was appointed as the chief executive, when the racing board was chaired by Michael Stiasny. The rumour in the industry is that they made a mistake in the document that they sent to Endre Brown in relation to his salary, and that he received an artificially high salary, and instead of fixing the mistake, owning up to it, they simply gazumped all the other salaries to make Endre Brown's salary relative. Now, that's an outrageous accusation to make, but that's a prevalent thought amongst those on the ground level in the racing industry, and I would like to see that cleared up. But I mean, this is now going back 12 years, so we've been waiting a long time, and all the other issues that have cropped up with the management of the racing industry, the purchase of the Best Bets Turf Digest operation after initially they'd said that there was no way they were going to purchase it. The treatment of the Informant magazine, which was the only independent magazine. The racing board has basically effected control of all the media on racing. There is no journalist that tells the truth about racing in the media.
We've got 1 minute. We've got 1 minute left, sir.
I'm sorry?
We've got 1 more minute left.
There's no journalist that tells the truth about racing. People know in the industry, if you speak up, you're gone. Basically, what I'm saying is you need to investigate the current racing industry properly and ascertain what the real situation is, because you're listening to the people in the main who have caused the problem and other people who have, in my view, mismanaged the racing industry to its almost total destruction. To think that they could keep that, and they are proposing more of the same. Well, that's just insanity. And I think that as a select committee, you would not be fulfilling your duty if you were not to ask for a proper investigation of the racing industry to find out what the facts relating to the current status are and how any future racing industry can be properly constructed from the ground up, not the penthouse down.
Okay, thank you very much for your submission. Like I said earlier on, we'll give you a chance to resubmit that written submission.
Thank you.
And hopefully you'll get that back to us. Thank you very much. Cheers. And we're going next to the Asian Racing Federation via video conference.
Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Andrew Harding. I'm the Secretary General of the Asian Racing Federation, and I'm also the Executive Director of Racing for the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And I've heard earlier submissions making reference to the Jockey Club. The Asian Racing Federation is a federation of the major racing jurisdictions in the region, and my submission goes to the Thoroughbred Code because that's the sport which the Asian Racing Federation represents. And the points that I want to make to you are really confined to the issue of the relationship between the code body for thoroughbred racing and New Zealand TAB, and in particular clause 81 of the bill. What I wanted to invite to your attention, Chair, members of the committee, are really 3 points. And the first goes to the report by John Massara, which I have to say is an excellent study of the relationship between wagering and racing and the best models to achieve the best outcomes for a sustainable racing industry. And really what's identified there is that in terms of the integration between racing, broadcasting and wagering, there are degrees of integration. At one end, we have complete vertical integration of racing, broadcasting and wagering. And we see that in Hong Kong, in Japan, in South Korea. And in those jurisdictions, it operates extremely successfully. Prize money is very strong. customer growth is strong, turnover is increasing, the investment in infrastructure is able to be made to provide a durable base for the industry into the future. Also successful is the model that we see, for example, in New South Wales and in Victoria. Now, it's not a completely integrated model, but what it does involve is that racing not only produces product, but also then owns its own intellectual property rights, which enables it to do the following: to enter into, on equal terms, commercial relationships with the broadcasters. At the same time, racing is able to enter into commercial arrangements, program and product agreements with the wagering operator. And for those wagering operators that don't have those commercial agreements, then there is a safety net in Australia called the Race Fields legislation. And New Zealand now, of course, has the offshore betting charges. In each instance, racing has control of its own intellectual property rights and is able to enter into sound commercial agreements with the broadcaster, with the wagering operator, that see racing grow, that see racing have a durable and sustainable base for its future. At the other end of the spectrum would be a racing code that has no control over its own intellectual property rights. That would be the weakest form of integration. That's no integration. And really that's the nub, as I read it, that's the nub of the report that John Massara has made. And what he's recommended is that there be a strong, properly equipped wagering operator, but at the same time, the code body be equipped and enabled to have commercial arrangements with the wagering operator for the commercial exploitation of racing's intellectual property rights. Now, the second point that I wanted to invite your attention is that what I've just described here in terms of what's best practice, what are the best principles, are indeed what's found in the International Agreement on Breeding, Racing and Wagering, which is administered by the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities. And so we detail in the submission, Article 28A of the International Agreement makes it plain that racing should always be in the position of being able to provide consent to the use of its intellectual property rights. And the third thing that I wanted to invite to your attention is what I've described here in terms of what's best practice for the commercial use of racing's intellectual property rights is indeed what we see in other major sports. One wouldn't imagine that, say, New Zealand Rugby would not own its own intellectual property rights in what it produces, would not be in a position of being able to enter into its own commercial arrangements for the exploitation of its intellectual property. And indeed, one looks to the bill, that's exactly what is reflected there in clauses 71 and 72. If TAB New Zealand wishes to use rugby, New Zealand Rugby, for commercial purposes, then it must first gain the consent of New Zealand Rugby. And that's the correct principle in the Asian Racing Federation's submission to you. I think related to that, in terms of this submission that I've made about clause 81, is also the offshore betting charge. The Massara report recommends that that be really administered by the code body. Where this construct was first developed in Australia, that's the model that's employed there, so that it's the code body that's able to set the charge at a reasonable level, and is then able to use the funds to the best purpose in terms of growing the industry. And that, I think, is consistent with what we've said about the best use of intellectual property rights in clause 81. The submission, though, I wanted to make to you, Chair, members of the committee, but I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, Andrew.
Hey, well, thank you, Mr. Harding. I agree wholesomely with what you're saying around intellectual property, because it's very unusual ever to put intellectual property into an operating entity like a TAB. You just simply don't structure it that way. From your perspective, the IP, the level of IP, you have what you have now and what you may have in the future, and we need to be forward-leaning rather than thinking about exactly what we know now, because wagering and betting and broadcasting are going to change over the next few years, sure bet. But from your perspective, does anyone ever value these IP and racing codes and actually place a value on it? Have you ever seen any focus on that sort of aspect?
It's a very good question. There's an attempt to do that. This was an interesting exercise that was entered into when the race girls legislation was introduced in Australia. New entrants, they didn't have a regulatory requirement in terms of a license to have an arrangement with racing. What value is placed on the racing product that, say, Ladbrokes or William Hill use? And there's been a nice development of that. So racing's been able to say over time, some of what we produce has more value than other aspects of what we produce. So, for example, a Group 1 race has a higher value than a listed race or a non-black type race. And so in New South Wales, for example, the racing industry charges to the wagering operator a premium for the use of its intellectual property associated with its premium racing. So I haven't directly answered your question in terms of saying what's a total value of the intellectual property that racing creates, but this is an emerging area, and we see this, as I say, in the development of race fields in Australia, recognising that not everything that racing produces has the same level of value, and that's precisely why racing should have the power to control the pricing, so that that product that has greater value to the wagering operator can be charged for at a higher level than other aspects of what racing produces.
Okay, and so yeah, by implication, you've answered the question. Just so you made this comment, and I see it in your submission, you talk about wagering and you talked about broadcasting. In your submission, you actually wrap them together. Do you ever see situations where there's a dividing line? So you have a wagering operation. In fact, you may have several outlets for wagering, depending on what the event is, and you have a separate broadcasting. Do you ever see that sort of differentiation going on?
Look, we see it in different jurisdictions. I have to say, the model that seems to operate best in terms of the experience to date is the fully integrated model. So as I said, in Japan, the Japan Racing Association has a number of tracks. It's also the wagering operator, it's also the broadcaster. And that model operates extremely well. In Australia, in Victoria, they have entered into their own arrangements that are separate and different to the arrangements that New South Wales has in terms of the broadcast rights it produces. And that is doing interesting things in terms of developing the customer base. So that we have seen in different jurisdictions, different approaches taken to this. In some cases, a single broadcaster owned by the racing industry. In other jurisdictions, multiple broadcasters. But throughout all of this, the common thread is that racing is able to make the decision on who uses its intellectual property. It's able to enter into the commercial arrangements with the respective broadcasters, having assessed what is in racing's best commercial interests.
And that's the core thing that's missing in the legislation, because the key, what you're saying, and if I sort of repeat it back to you, but your key point is John Massara report specified that there should be a Racing New Zealand, which is effectively what you're talking about, that represents the code, contracts with the wagering operation, and that's essential in terms of equilibrium around contracting rights and ability and capability. But secondly, there should also be an accountability, shouldn't there? That's the other thing that's silent. I've never heard anyone talk about it. I find it amazing. There's no accountability written into the legislation of the TAB back to the codes, nor the ability of the codes to monitor specifically and have that right of the TAB. That, if you're going to have equal partners and you're going to have a good relationship, that it actually involves accountability and monitoring. And that part of it I don't see in the legislation.
Indeed, as I read the Massara report, I think that is part and parcel of the notion of commercial arrangements. So under those commercial arrangements, I give you this in return for you doing this. And then there's a capacity to review the performance. There's, in every commercial arrangement, there must be the capacity to determine whether the agreement is being faithfully delivered. So accountability can be delivered either by the terms of the commercial arrangements, or as you indicate, they can be enshrined in the legislation itself. But necessarily, if one is to say that racing is going to be placed in a position of being able to ensure that it has a sustainable future, then in each of these relationships, whether it's the broadcaster or the wagering operator, racing must A, own its commercial property, the property that it produces, and be able to enter into, on equal terms, commercial arrangements with those who might use that, whether for broadcasting or wagering purposes. And accountability is part and parcel of that.
Okay.
Ian, no, we've got to
So I've just got a very quick one, a supplementary question to that really. Do you think it's possible, given our structure, for three codes to collectively negotiate those wagering agreements?
Well, we've seen examples elsewhere of the program and product agreements having to some degree a common approach. I mean, there will be tensions, and let's speak plainly. It's not the case in Australia, in Korea or South Korea or Hong Kong. There's only one code of racing. In Australia, there are three codes of racing, and there is commercial tension between the interests of harness racing and thoroughbred racing and greyhound racing. But there have been successful models under which there has been a capacity to combine, to enter into some degree of commercial relationship with the TAB. I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily easy, but it's certainly achievable.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your submission this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
And next we've got Marko Marikovic, video conference, please. Hello, Mr. Marikovic.
Good. I'm here. Good. Oh, here we go.
Yep. So we've got 5 minutes allocated for your submission. If you'd like to go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair and your committee. My name's Marko Marikovic, and I would actually prefer to have appeared in person, but I'm stuck in Rara at the moment.
Oh, I bet you would.
And the violence.
You're having a time.
Sorry, guys. And it's not kind of virus. Okay. I hope there'll be a lot of questions after you've read my submission. And there's a number of points I'll just cap on, so I presume you've read it. The bill, in my opinion, or in our opinion, seems to have been drafted by people, and this is not an accusation, considering what the other guy said, like they were locked in a room because they were out of touch with what is happening on the other side of the coin. So on one side of the coin, what the bill has addressed, which is very good, in terms of the infrastructure, it's a bit like what Ryan Briley used to do with companies. You know, they strip the assets and cut out the loss and carry on. But through reducing the number of courses, that's obvious. But I think it's also suffocating some of the regionals and the communities that need these courses. And I think the regional tracks can be saved, which I'll touch on later. Now, my point about the bill opposing it, I don't think the other side of the coin has been looked at carefully enough. It's basically a number of people that have been missed out of how you manage them and how you actually help them participate in the industries. You've got the punters, the event seekers, you know, it's the next generation. I've been focused in the last year or so purely on harness, but obviously the same stats, the same information has happened across all racing codes, not only in New Zealand, but in Australia and other markets. So we are losing, you know, local people. We're not looking at the globe in terms of other racing destinations of how we can participate with them. We're not looking at mobile technology. I'll touch on that later. And global wagering is rather massive. New Zealand is a tiny little dot on that landscape. And we're not looking at how we future-proof the industry. We're future-proofing it through the assets but we're not future-proofing it through how people participate with the sport. If people don't go to a sport and they don't participate, they don't wager, then where does the revenue come from? So the revenue comes from the punters, the people that are wagering. Let's call them the consumer. They're not being looked after. So there's no wagering, there's no racing. The second point I want to make is around the TAB needs to look at a number of things. Obviously, better customer engagement. They can be responsible across all the codes they are the common denominator across all codes and all sports. New technology, they are missing out on looking at global markets, not just Australia. If you think Australia is successful, they're not. They're bleeding. Look at my clause there. I think it was clause 2A, B, and C. You look at the revenues just in harness globally, right? So you've got New Zealand's just 400 million. Australia's 2 billion. France, I had no idea of this. France is 7 billion. Sweden's 1.8. And then globally, it's about 15 billion. New Zealand is 0.006% of that market. You know, if you're trying to run a business, which this is, we've got to look for other markets to participate in or get them to participate in us. And that's been missed out totally. Third point, clause 81, which everybody seems to be having a crack at. The IP rights, 100% of the IP rights going to the TAB is absolute nonsense. Why? It removes competition, it eliminates innovation, and it also sets them up to be out-licensed. If you put all the information, all the package, all the filming, everything together in one package, I believe there's an opportunity there for, say, Tab Corp or one of the UK guys to come in and co-license and take it away from New Zealand. Australia is suffering. As I said, look at clause 2A, B, and C. Next point. 4, the issue of risk mitigation. Look, it's a serious issue. Wagering over mobile can be managed far better versus the current lip service that has been given. I've been to a number of races and I've had a look. There's no management of somebody over betting. You can't tell. There's no coordination between that individual's account and somebody else. Yes, we say you've got to be 18 plus, but the rest of it is not managed. I don't know what the stats are of how many people have been pulled up, but it's not great and it can be managed better going futurely. Now, I'm talking about if you go global and you're looking for bigger money or bigger wagering revenues, it could be, and it's done by mobile or on the internet, you can actually manage it better. Just back a few weeks ago, I just got back from a tour of France and Sweden. I got taken over by the HRA, the Harness Racing Australia. It was pretty good, actually.
Are you always on holiday?
No, I'm recovering from that one. But seriously, we went to the centenary at the Hippodrome, which was kind of weird. And it was 100 years between America and France. And you know, how do they put on a presentation? There was 100 Harleys, there was 100 dancing girls, 100 flags, and the races were phenomenal. And also, I think that last person was making a comment within Le Trot owns the stadium, and it also is partner with PUM, which is our TAB. And inside the building, they've got all the broadcast, the whole one-stop match is within that whole facility. So getting back from there, we went to Le Gras, which is a training track. I think you saw the comment in there. It's like 1,200 acres of a park that Napoleon had as his hunting ground. And there's 40 kilometers of track. Like the facilities and the money that is spent in Europe on harness racing, which is the reverse of gallops here, it's phenomenal. And I think there's an opportunity for New Zealand to go with technology into other global markets. Final points, look at another way. Like, I think there's no difference between our racing industry in New Zealand. Visualize this as like a bricks and mortar store. It's a business. We're 2020, and what's it going to look like in 2030, 40 or 50? I think the bill is trying to reduce the number of stores to save costs. But what you've done, or I think what the bill has done, is forgot to think about the customer, the punter, the industry, all the people that work in it. You know, it's a huge industry. And online shoppers, in this case, the digital mobile, have been forgotten about. You look at any business, look at the ones now where what Alibaba, JD.com, WeChat have done to business in China. We're years behind, but we're following it. It's the same principle that needs to apply to racing. So in summary, I've made 7 points. I want you to look at, I think you should look at the other side of the coin. There's infrastructure, but the sustainability of the industry will come from the punters, the customers, and engagement with these people. Point 2, TAB has to become more innovative, and they have to help the codes and sports with better customer engagement. Point 3, don't follow Australia for ideas, go north, even though Missouri is well represented, but the market there is suffering. And I've seen the financials of a couple of the codes, and it's not great. IP rights to the TAB is a nonsense. It'll fail long term. Risk management. If you grow the wagering pool, it will be no worse. It'll probably be better if it's done through mobile, because you've got different ways of managing the risk management side of it. 6, make sure that RETA, Racing Board, or whatever it's going to be called in the future, or the TAB, the board is more than just doers in some of the old hands, and can grow. And they have to be able to grow the business, not to manage a hemorrhaging business to death. And my final point is to rethink local and act global. The end.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Any questions?
No, we're just jealous.
Let's go. Let him carry on with his work.
Questions?
Yeah. Hey, tell us about some of the online. You talked about real-time mobile and race betting. You know, we all know about it. So, when you're overseas, what? Just give us a view on what that future looks like, or what it is currently there that we're not doing here.
Okay, so each of the courses, obviously, like the TAB, record the race and it's broadcast locally. So what you can do with this mobile technology and what we've been developing, as an example, we know that we're a world first in this, is 360, where it's actually on the drivers or the jockeys or whatever. And so when you're participating or watching the race, you can be in the race itself. So we're setting this up around the world. So you could be on a race, you could link in, or you could choose a race you're interested in. Let's say if it's harness in Paris, you can get links and stuff, and you can then participate and possibly bet on it. And so it could be vice versa as well. There's no reason why people in Europe or Australia or America can't bet on races in New Zealand. And this is what I was highlighting.
And why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it here?
Because the TAB spent quite a bit of money on something similar but failed. But this is world first stuff. No one's been able to crack the coding, and we've been able to do it. We did a POC, which is a proof of concept, at the Inter-Dominion just last year. And just to show you how much money the industry's got, the whole campaign for the promotion of the Inter-Dominion, that's where they got me involved, was $30,000, which is bloody ridiculous. This is a major race between New Zealand and Australia. So we had to get other funders to come in, and Australia came in the end when they saw it, and they bought the rights to it.
Wow. I
went to the racing board, I went to New Zealand, I went to everyone. All we wanted was 250, and now New Zealand's lost out on potentially several $100 million of revenue. New Zealand's got, seriously, the industry and the board need to have a boot up their ass because they're bloody hopeless. Sorry.
All right, I better not ask you another question.
Okay. All right. No. Thank you.
Not Bailey.
We'll let you get back to your hard work there.
I'm going for a swim now. Good luck. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, John Masara, please. We've had hours of submissions, and your name was brought up quite often. So it's good to have you here. Thank you very much for coming.
Pleasure.
And we've got a bit of time, and I assume we've got a number of questions. So yeah, go ahead, please, with your submission. Okay.
Firstly, let me thank members of the Select Committee for the invitation to appear before you on this, the last day of submissions. I'm mindful that I'm not a stakeholder in the New Zealand industry, and that submissions are a privilege of industry participants. However, with the Select Committee's indulgence, I will make some observations and explain the underlying objectives of my 2018 review of the New Zealand racing industry. Let me say it should be more specifically called the New Zealand thoroughbred racing industry, because that was the specification, and that's what I concentrated on. I think the Minister wanted a wider review, but I said to him that I was not qualified to do the other two, and that was the area I would concentrate on. But the others would benefit from some of the initiatives that might come from this review. Let me firstly confirm that after all this time and listening to not all, but a lot of the submissions and reading all the commentary that's come out over the time, I still stand firmly behind my 2018 review and all of its recommendations. But the review is a review about structure. It doesn't deal, at the end of the day, with the minutiae in the industry and the day-to-day operations. This will be the work of the leadership and the personnel of the industry. That can't be replaced, and I don't deal with this, but I'm assuming that in tandem with this review and any changes that might come from it, there'll be a review of the quality of the leadership and the quality of the operators within the game. At the end of the day, personnel is everything. New Zealand racing was a jurisdiction that was batting way above its average for a very long time last century, enjoying great respect from its Australian counterparts and beyond. The renowned expertise of its participants and its famous grazing pastures made the New Zealand racing and breeding industry an icon of the 20th century horse racing world. As a young lad, I myself clearly remember how my family and racing friends would speak with trepidation year after year of New Zealand invaders plundering Australia's major races. The New Zealand yearling sales, in those days held at Trentham, were nothing less than a rite of passage for any aspiring investor in thoroughbreds in our region, of which I was one. Trentham was a veritable pilgrimage of owners and trainers from around the globe, with Aussie breeders looking on in awe as New Zealand competitors dominated the Australasian bloodstock market. So much so that in 1985, Australian breeders, led by the late Colin Hayes, the great trainer, who was also a big breeder, Lindsay Park-Stud, lobbied the Hawke government to amend the breeding stock provisions in the Tax Act, specifically, quote, to enable Australia to compete with New Zealand. The 1985 federal budget did bring in the changes sought, and this heralded the beginning of a long period of sustained reform in the Australian industry, with obvious benefits being enjoyed today. Ironically, I was the person who authored that submission to Treasury in 1985 on behalf of the industry. And yet today, the boot is on the other foot, with New Zealand breeders and trainers thinking of abandoning the industry here in order to survive. And you can imagine the consequences of this on employment and the industry itself, the very fundamentals of the industry. The 2018 review resulted from an approach from Minister Winston Peters, who, like the late Bob Hawke, has a real interest in racing. I was commissioned to undertake the review by the Minister because of the poor state of thoroughbred racing in New Zealand, which is a result of a 30-year gradual slide. The Minister made it clear that he wanted a full review, warts and all, of the problems of your industry and the solutions to turn it around. It was also clear to me that the Minister sought recommendations that would make the industry sustainable into the future and independent of government. At first blush, it appeared to me that your industry was suffering from three things: paucity of revenue, shortage of capital, and a suboptimal governance structure. But I also felt that this situation could be righted with a reform program aimed at modernising your industry, introducing new revenue measures, and maximising the use of existing assets. I then sought the assistance of three experienced racing and wagering administrators: John Rouse, a previous CEO of the Australian Jockey Club and currently a trustee of Randwick Racecourse working on racetrack consolidations; Darryl Lowenthal, a retired senior public servant in New South Wales who was responsible for a number of legislative changes and is currently a consultant to Racing New South Wales; to assist me on governance and structure, and Craig Nugent, the recently retired Chief Operating Officer of Tabcorp, to assist on wagering. So this was not just a John Massara on his own effort. I did draw on my network of experts there, and they certainly gave me a hand. I'm very grateful for their input. We live at a time when the racing and wagering worlds are globalising. Horses travel around the world to compete in feature events, and wagering operators are consolidating to form international corporate wagering giants. It is also a time when Asia is emerging as a big player in our region. These factors, in my view, represent opportunities for New Zealand. Also, racing here, like everywhere else, is facing growing competition from other forms of leisure and gambling, as well as continuous attacks from the animal welfare lobby. These are challenges for New Zealand and for every other jurisdiction in racing. So we've got opportunities and we've got some challenges here. The review recommendations seek to arm the New Zealand industry to deal with these factors, but this will necessarily mean change. And in some cases, that change will be profound. It will be the willingness of stakeholders to focus unselfishly on the well-being of New Zealand racing as a whole that will determine the success of these reforms. All of the 17 review recommendations can be categorised under 3 major headings: industry modernisation, revenue enhancement, better utilisation of industry assets. Pretty simple. And every one of those, and I've tested it, fall into one of those categories. I note that some of the revenue recommendations requiring legislation have already been passed, and that the bill now under consideration contains a number of clauses related to other recommendations in the review. Given that prize money is the single most effective lever available to reinvigorate the New Zealand thoroughbred industry, I would encourage the government to expedite arrangements for racefield fees and point of consumption tax. And I urge the industry to make a serious commitment to negotiate an advantageous TAB New Zealand outsourcing deal. By the way, that doesn't mean selling any part of the TAB. I'm talking about an operating joint venture with a giant wagering operator who can give us access to their expertise, their development, etc., which we can't afford to do on our own here because we haven't got the scale and therefore the available resources. And the last speaker was talking about some of the things that are happening around the world. We can't compete, but you might be able to compete if you can piggyback on one of the major players who spend 100 million on average a year on product development, something we can't do in New Zealand. These are all new sources of much needed industry revenue. I'm talking about a joint venture with a major wagering operator, and I'm talking about the 3 new forms of income that came via the First Act. I don't want to take issue, I don't wish to take issue with the current bill on a clause-by-clause basis. However, I should advise that this is not the time for compromise on matters that go to the thoroughbred industry sustainability and its independence from government. A number of the review's modernisation recommendations relate to the devolution of power to the codes. I hope that's a word, an English word, devolving power to the codes. And I still hold firmly to the belief that this notion is fundamental to the success of the reform package, and I think we just heard Andrew say the same thing. And that's the experience. We've got precedents elsewhere for this. I don't want to comment on the recommendations made in part 3. I do want to comment on the recommendations made in part 3 of my report, because I believe that racecourse consolidation, which I know is a highly emotional issue, and I sympathise and I'm empathetic, because my farm is in a country area, in a regional area, and I felt the sort of feelings that I'm hearing here from various of the respondents. So I do want to comment on recommendations made in part 3. That's one of the areas I do want to touch on, because I believe that racecourse consolidation is critically important to the reform package. Various independent reports on the New Zealand thoroughbred industry, dating back to the Reid Commission in 1965 and the McCarthy Royal Commission on Racing in 1969, have all recommended the importance of significant rationalisation of New Zealand thoroughbred racing venues, but little has been done over all that period. There have been subsequent inquiries as well in the 90s, all saying the same thing. You've got to look at restructuring your venues. In relation to this, the work we did as part of the review in 2018 showed that many clubs, if looked at on a standalone basis, this is the mistake here, they've got to be looked at. The test here is if they're looked at on a standalone basis, would not be able to afford current prize money levels without the subsidies provided by New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing. So no, they're not profitable. The majority of clubs aren't profitable, particularly if they're to maintain the prize money, the indicated prize money levels, and let alone if we wanted to raise those prize money levels, which is a reality. We have to do that over time. That said, most venues and tracks are also in a state of disrepair. I don't think anyone disagrees with that one. Against this, we estimated that total capital expenditure required to bring all 48 current operating venues up to an acceptable standard in terms of tracks and facilities was 294 million. And for the 28 tracks, we recommended to be retained. So we suggested the 20 be merged and the tracks sold, 20 clubs be merged, and the 28 that we retained, it would cost 190 million to improve those to a competitive level. Now, that's not money that we seek to get from the government. This is money that, these are assets which are not deployed in the best possible way in what is a business, in effect. It's a business of sport, of racing, and it can't continue to keep putting its hat out to the government for more money. So we looked at ways and means by which the industry itself could generate that money and at the same time improve its profitability. So best use of resources that the industry has. I would like to assure the Select Committee that this rationalisation is not proposed as a cosmetic exercise. Better tracks and facilities will better showcase New Zealand Thoroughbred racing to domestic and international audiences, provide for more consistent form lines because of better tracks, and ultimately give a boost to wagering turnover. There is a good dividend out of all of this other than the capital that we release. Currently, much of New Zealand racing on TV and on smart devices looks somewhat shabby by international standards, I have to say. And that's got to be lifted. I see the growth here coming from New Zealand racing being marketed to overseas venues. Not looking for New Zealand people to gamble more. We know that they gamble about 40% per head of their Australian counterpart. We're not looking to lift that necessarily, but we're looking to get the quality of racing good enough to compete with, say, Australia and other places on the international sphere so that we can get gamblers from overseas to bet on New Zealand racing and to provide revenue for us without necessarily inciting our own local population to gamble. Currently, much of New Zealand racing on TV, I said that, yeah. Thus, a consolidation of tracks, including the sale or closure of surplus tracks and the investment of any proceeds into the remaining tracks is a priority. And I know it's touchy, and I've seen the number of, people making submissions on this in a very emotional way. And there's a little bit of truth to what everybody says. All the people I've heard today have some truth in what they say. And the issue, for example, of community assets, I think that has to be taken into account. I accept that. But in most cases, these tracks are the property of the racing industry. And from the merger that results from some of the recommendations will come property that can be sold and which will provide the sort of money we need to improve the remaining tracks to a level which will allow us to have viability on a long-term basis. I also note that mention was made in submissions to the Select Committee that a rationalisation of venues had not occurred in my home state of New South Wales. It is definitely arguable that there should be rationalisation in New South Wales. I push that myself. However, the extraordinarily strong financial position of racing in New South Wales has not made that an imperative. This is not the case in New Zealand. It's absolutely imperative here. New South Wales is better off by a factor of, I don't know, 120 million or something to what it was per annum to what it was 6 or 7 years ago. And so it's awash with money, and its prize money is reflecting that, and this is why the industry is so buoyant now. That's not the case here. We've got to cut our cloth accordingly. But good business would say that in New South Wales, there ought to be some consolidations. I agree with that claim, but it's not imperative. In the light of all this, I commend the submission of New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing to the Select Committee. So I'm not speaking on a clause-by-clause basis, but I have read the New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing submission, and I think it goes pretty close to the mark to sort of bringing the Act a little bit closer to our recommendations. And so I commend that submission to you. It summarises the final amendments that need to be made to the Racing Reform Act to reach the goals of the reform program I have recommended. I have a couple of final comments, if I may, Chairman. The 17 recommendations in the review were designed to work as a matrix to reverse the fortunes of your industry, and any significant departure from them will affect the ultimate outcome. You can't pull one out and say, well, here, we're doing all of these, but we're not going to do this one, because there's a balance between all of them. Simply put, cherry picking the reform program will compromise the future success and prosperity of the entire industry. And such is the pace of progress and competition in global racing and wagering that New Zealand will be permanently left behind. This is our last chance here. This is quite literally your industry's last chance to secure a vibrant and successful role in the 21st century racing. My second point, if I may, these recommendations are based not on theory or ideological conviction, but on real practical experience of what works, based on my time as Chairman of Racing New South Wales and then as Chairman of Racing Australia, leading the Australian thoroughbred industry through a period of deep reform. I know exactly how much effort, passion and courage is required to enact the recommendations in the review, but the rewards are immense if you can pull it off. Australian racing now has the kind of prize money, facilities, events, integrity and leadership that makes people from across Australia and around the world want to be part of it. As owners, as punters, breeders, trainers and jockeys, and all the many other roles that our industry can offer to the next generation. They're there wanting to get involved. Presently, there's very little future in this country in racing. I have no doubt, though, that the New Zealand industry, with its illustrious history, its expertise, its natural assets and its favourable time slot, you're 2 hours before Australia or 3 hours before Australia, and that's 3 hours, and that's 5 or 6 hours before Asia. You've got a magnificent time slot for that morning before race day, before those race days overseas, where you can slot in magnificently there and capture that marketplace, that wagering marketplace, if your product is up to scratch. But you need to transform the industry into a viable, independent, modern industry with its racing capable of being marketed competitively outside of New Zealand. It's got to be as good as your competition, if not better. And there are changes happening all the time. Now, I didn't cover every one of those here because obviously I'm assuming that leadership and management of the industry, that's their job. We can't, this is not, I'm not covering the minutiae here. I'm talking about the structure, getting the structure right and making sure the right people are in place after that to run the show. I believe the process is underway to make the changes. We're here for that purpose. You've already had one act come through and we're not far. We're very close to having a structure in place that's going to make the industry viable here. Oh yes, there's going to be some crying and some moaning, I know, and some people will have a case and those people need to be listened to. I accept that. But at the end of the day, we're close to an ultimate result to create an atmosphere of confidence in the industry from within New Zealand and beyond. And this will bring on a lot of economic, social and community benefits. I think the Minister, the government, and of course the Select Committee need to give a very clear statement to the industry, which is on its knees at present, to say, hey, we're serious about getting this thing back on deck. You're all going to have to pull your weight, but we're going to give you a structure that's workable. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to run it, and don't keep coming back with your hats asking for more money because everything's in place to make it work here. But as I always say in these cases, everything will depend on the quality of leadership and the quality of personnel. At the end of the day, people run businesses and run governments and run everything. So, and race courses. So the intention of the review was simply to give us a way forward, give us a bit of a structure, a program, pathway. And I'm gratified that a lot of what's been suggested is now being considered. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I also want to thank you for the extraordinary effort and enthusiasm you put into this whole program. We're very fortunate to have had you. But I just want to ask you a question which isn't entirely addressed in here, and it relates to the commercial tension that drives our TAB. And I suppose if you think about the fact that we've talked about the beneficial owners of the TAB for a long time, you said, well, beneficial owners drive stuff all in my experience. It's not through your own pockets effective. And I wonder whether you had any comment to make on the ownership structure of our TAB, not the fact that we could then sell it overseas or whatever, just the simple ownership. Your report talked about an accountability to Racing New Zealand effectively. I wonder if you wanted to comment on that.
Look, Mr. McKelvey, Ian, if I may, I think the TAB is owned by the racing industry. I know it was established in the very early 50s, and I think it's owned by the racing industry. I think it was seeded by the clubs originally, and retained earnings over the years have built it up into the business it is today, generating $135 million a year or so profit, which then gets distributed out. But it's never been said anywhere. And I think it would add a lot of gravity to what's happening here if someone in authority, perhaps as part of this whole thing, were to say, by the way, I know this hasn't been clarified before, but we think the TAB is owned by the industry, has always been owned by the industry. No one's been able to tell me anything to the contrary. But I think it would add a lot of confidence. Now, it wouldn't change a lot. But for example, if the minister, after listening to what select committee, etc., has to say, were minded to leave the IP in the TAB, which, by the way, I agree with most views that that's not the place it should be, including Andrew's, Harding's view. But if you were to want to do that, if it was demonstrably part of the racing industry, owned by the racing industry, it'd take a lot of the pressure off that clause, for example. Because at the end of the day, well, it's in that body instead of that body, but they're both part of the racing industry. We know that, it's been confirmed. And we'll just make some contractual arrangements in terms of which parts of the IP go where. So that would certainly neutralise the heat out of that argument. So I think, you know, I'd love to see it. And I've raised it a few times in meetings and what have you. Nobody's ever able to guarantee you that it's owned by the industry, but my research indicates that it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew. Right. We'll go Andrew first.
First of all, thanks for coming, and it was a very good report. I want to try and take it up a level because if you broadly look at your recommendations, you recognise the 3 codes. You did recommend Racing New Zealand, and you then, we have TAB out to the right here. And what you did is then you talked about governance structures that went across the top. You talked about contractual relationships between Racing New Zealand and the TAB, and there's also back. So to me, and if I interpreted what you wrote, to me that was about creating an accountability from the codes to some entity that then was in a position to negotiate and monitor TAB, all for the good of the industry.
For mutual benefit.
And for mutual benefit. Yeah. But also gave, from a perspective of structure, gave an entity in the middle who had the capability and capacity to be able to do that adequately on behalf of the 3 codes. And also it would undertake a whole stack of functions, including equine research as one of them, but one of many. And so what we've ended up with in the bill is that has not been incorporated. And I think that's a key part of your recommendation.
It is. I was surprised to see it left out, but it has been. I think you've described it well. It's a cooperative body between the three codes to operate on issues that are common to the three, to negotiate transactions that could be common to the three. And by doing so, by aggregating those things, you could probably do better deals. Right. So, yes, the codes could meet informally and do the same thing, which is, I think, what the bill probably, is envisaging. I think it's better to have this vehicle, Racing New Zealand, which doesn't have to meet every week. It doesn't have to have a huge edifice. It can be, I know in New South Wales, we have a similar body that meets 2 or 3 times a year. It's got a secretary who's also an executive of one of the codes, usually the larger code. So it might be an executive of New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing. He becomes a secretary of that little company. And they meet 2 or 3 times a year on matters. And in between time, the secretary seems to contact everybody and keeps things going. It's for major decisions. It's not for minute decisions. The minute decisions are left to the codes. Yeah. But these are for big commercial decisions, race dates where you don't want to be, crossing each other and that sort of thing. Yeah, there are some benefits to be had by I think, having a formal structure there. But I think the draft, the act, I think is envisaging that this could happen informally. Yeah, I think it's neater having a formal structure myself.
Yeah, and because if we're trying to do our role and trying to set this up for the next 20 years, we're to not do it now and be clear about what it should do actually creates a big hole of that structure. So part of that relationship is one is the commercial. And so for Racing New Zealand about to enter into arrangements with the TAB, you must have the IP and you must have the ability to negotiate. And on the other side, you have to have TAB with the capability to go and get into bed with big, whopping great, very sophisticated wagering operations. And there's an element of accountability back between
Absolutely.
And so that raises sort of governance issues.
Yes.
And there's a recommendation that it should be 4 and 3. And without getting into the details, a lot of view that should be more skills-based rather than putting people on.
Yes.
Inside that Racing New Zealand, so one is a commercial relationship and one is accountability back to the codes, but also there's a whole stack of other functions that should be undertaken in there, shouldn't there? Not
that many. My experience is there's significant functions. There's not many of them, but they can be important. I list them in the report, which I've got here, but it'll take me a couple of minutes to find it. Right. But there's 4 or 5 things which come up. They're not. They don't come up every day. They're for example, when you're looking at your race schedule, you look at it at the beginning of the year and you set it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to keep going back to it unless there's a crisis. The same applies to any commercial transactions with third parties. You establish a fee rate and you make arrangements and you do it. So there's not that many. The minutiae, the day-to-day minutiae has to remain the job of the codes. Okay. That's the job of the codes because the cultures are different in the 3 racing codes. I wouldn't like to have to write a report that included trotters and dogs because I know absolutely nothing about the other 2. Okay. And that's why I didn't do so. I couldn't do so.
Have you seen the purpose statement for the TAB in the bill?
In the bill?
Yeah.
I have, but
it's not your level of detail. Because, and we just heard certain representations, but at the moment, the purpose statement basically says maximise profit for the long-term benefit of the industry and also for the sporting. And you've been involved in this. One of the concerns I have is if you create a very commercial board, commercial boards act commercially, which means they will maximise profit. Sometimes you can do your job by mixing profits in the short term, and one is about creating a sustainable industry over the long term. And so I was seeking to see whether you'd had looked at far enough, because I think one is you do want to maximise profit, But you want to have a long-term interest of supporting and creating a sustainable industry. Which
well, that's why your code representatives are on that TAB in the model we've suggested. There are 3 code representatives.
But there'll be 3 out of 4.
3 out of 7.
Or 3 out of 7. But that's...
We understand that, yeah. I think it's enough to put the case. At the end of the day, though, it has to be run on a proper business basis. Remember, some of these TABs in other countries are not even owned by racing. They're at arm's length. But in the agreements with those TABs, there's some very strict demands.
Right. Okay. I'll let someone else go first.
Thank you. Thanks again for all the work you've done on this. It's much appreciated. A couple of aspects I wanted to touch on. One, I just want to pick up on where you were at with Andrew there in relation to the structure of Racing NZ. And we've heard from a number of submitters around some concerns with the level of ministerial involvement under this legislation. And coming back to your early point at the start of your submission around the intent to have independence from government for the industry, would a structure like Racing NZ, where the codes have more control, more responsibility, and therefore potentially more accountability, could there be mechanisms within there where some of the current provisions that are allocated to the minister could actually be the responsibility of that entity instead, which would remove that level of oversight?
Now remember, that Racing New Zealand would only be a cooperative body of the 3 codes. It's the TAB that has the outside directors, okay? So the answer is yes, anything that it was felt affects the 3 codes could be considered by that board, absolutely. But that board is a board of the 3 codes only. And that's the way it operates, certainly in our jurisdiction over there. It's worked quite well.
Okay. And then I wanted to come on to another one that's been reasonably contentious, and you touched on it as well, around asset rationalisation aspect. And I don't want to get into the detail of the community aspects, and we've heard those pretty well canvassed, but I just wanted to test your view on the potential impact for an industry in those areas if, for example, their sole course is closing down and it's well attended for its 1 or 2 meets a year, community turns out for it. What impact will that have if the community no longer has a local interest in terms of their potential participation longer term? Not just those who turn up on race day, but actually the owners, the trainers as well, if they exit the industry.
Good question. We were mindful of that when we looked at the spread, and we ensured that every region had a track, and we ensured that every track that was closed had a track that was within an hour. And the proposal we're putting forward is these clubs should merge, so they have a sense of ownership of the joint club. They shouldn't disappear into the never, never. They should merge, and to the extent there's a cup that's run every year in one club, it could be run in the merged club under the name of the original club. You do everything to give them some continuity of ownership. But remember, we ensured that every region had racing, and that when we shut a club down, there was another club within an hour's driving distance. Now, that's not like having it down the back, outside the front door, but it's within an hour. If you're keen bean, you'll go, A lot of our Sydney clubs are 45 minutes from where we live, 50 minutes, and we go, So it's not that far. Look, we looked at all the metrics of these clubs. We looked at attendances, we looked at prize money, we looked at profitability, we looked at cash balances. They don't stack up. And the claims that are being made are, I think, not totally accurate. So having said that, some of them play twin roles in the local community where other things are held there, etc. And in those cases, I'm sympathetic, and so we need to look. You need to look at that on a case-by-case basis. Also, this whole club thing and venue proposal was not just plucked out of the air. We were privileged to sit on 2 subcommittee meetings of a venue subcommittee, where both the Racing Board and Thoroughbred Racing New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing, were already beginning to review their venues, and they had a venue subcommittee, and we had the benefit of some of the work they had done. They provided some of the financial metrics for us as well. So, we didn't do this in isolation. We looked at this with the industry itself.
And the reality is, without this, the solution is not there, isn't it?
I think it's got to be done. The great majority of it's got to be done. The financial, the sort of capital that be released will come majorly from a few close to city areas where there's some big benefits to be gained. But the sort of profitability and the standard lifting will come from reducing some of those outlying clubs. But we don't want to extinguish their keenness for racing, and we propose that the club should merge with the club next door, rather than, going into the never, never.
Yeah, thank you. So, you interested? You finished it? Yeah. Yeah, just carry on with that point.
Yeah.
This is the devil's issue, of course.
Yeah.
When you were making that recommendation, you've got two drivers. One is reducing the cost of thoroughbred New Zealand operating those tracks.
Yeah.
To the extent there's some support. And the second one is looking to realise assets and get money, so you get your 200 million.
200 million for that.
Now, the 200 million, as you've just said in your last statement, principally will come, and I think you implied it, will principally come from about 4 or 5 tracks in the upper North Island, and most people sort of know where they are.
Yeah.
And to the extent that they are free of, or they're not owned by the community council or have some form of other private ownership, and they're unfettered, that probably makes that easier to occur. Yes. But that's where the big bucks are.
Correct.
So for the rest of them, and we had Reefton today and a whole stack of them, but the driver to close them partly is around getting better quality racetracks to meet our international market, which is your earlier point. But presumably also, do you see, by going from 48 to 28, do you see significant cost savings, operating cost savings? And did you come to a view on how significant that was?
We did have a look at it, and I haven't got those numbers at my disposal, but there was there were savings to be had. The thing is, there is an analogy to this in New South Wales. If a club gets to that point, it becomes a non-TAB club, so it doesn't get its racing on TV, and the tab doesn't cover it, and they have local bookmakers down there, perhaps that's a solution.
Why can't we have that model here? Because
and then they support themselves.
Because we've heard a number of submitters. We had Marlborough. I don't know whether you listened, but we've had Marlborough and stuff. So they many of the smaller ones have advocated. Essentially, it's community run, a lot of local sponsorship. But the Australian situation, I think you're referring to, it's not country courses, but is there...
Country, but outlying a bit. Outlying country, yeah.
Is there a term for what they call
non-TAB meetings.
Non-TA country meetings.
Non-TAB meetings,
right.
Yeah.
And do those types of clubs survive? And
they survive by the sweat of their members who come in and make the pies and paint the fences and
they make a little bit of the bookmaking and largely it's sponsored by the locals. Yeah. But what it does is retain the training facility for people, which is...
Most of them don't have training facilities there. The training facilities are a little bit closer in.
See, we've had very powerful submissions from a range of people, all around the South Island mainly, who said, and quite legitimately, they've got trainers there and to actually put their horses on and go for the 45 an hour meet distance you're talking about.
Yeah.
Real distance there, they'll relocate this in.
If you established the all-weather tracks that we're promoting in the report.
Yeah, that's your 200 million,
within that money.
Yeah.
You would have training facilities adjoining those in a far more professional way and probably a far safer way than training horses on the rougher tracks that we're referring to, possibly. So there would be an alternative for trainers to perhaps move a little bit, but get into a very professional training facility with its own all-weather track, etc. that would be a way in which some of these trainers, okay, albeit having to move a bit, would get access to far better tracks and everything else.
Well, that's a different dimension. We haven't heard that dimension around safety before.
Yeah.
But a number of these, and we had a couple of trainers actually front up who said literally, when you say move a bit, they're saying we will relocate. And that will mean there's no local racing, there's no local training. People in the area don't see the significance in the local community. And their proposition, rightly or wrongly, was that over time, because you don't see it and you don't hear it, you don't get the community supporting your local race day down the track.
I don't think it'll have that sort of impact. Okay. That's my personal view, and I think the metrics indicate the same thing. The amount of money bet on those meetings, the amount of people attending those meetings, etc. Doesn't support that case.
Okay. Very good. That's why we needed you to come. Right. Who else is going to go? Because I'll keep going.
I've just got one other question. It relates to the judicial or the appointment of the Racing Integrity Board. Yeah. Do you think this structure set up in this bill is a sensible way of dealing with the racing integrity issues?
Ian, I didn't have much to do with that structure other than to suggest in the report that a specialist be retained to look at your existing structure for its suitability and make any recommendations. That was a job unto itself. What surprised me about the existing New Zealand structure is that you've got a set of stewards or a group of stewards that actually steward over three different types of racing. And I remember a minister in New South Wales coming to me one day and saying, you're doing a wonderful job with Racing New South Wales, you guys. You've got a great team. Would you like to take over the greyhounds and the trotting stewards, integrity? I said, Minister, if you force me to do that, I'll have to resign, because I don't know those sports. I don't know the people. I don't understand the culture of those sports, and there's no way we'll do a proper job there. I'm surprised that one set of stewards can actually, cover all three. Now, that hasn't changed, but they've added another dimension to it. But I have to say, I'll leave that one to the experts, because that's the suggestion I made in the report, and I'd rather not second guess the expert that came in.
Thank you.
Tim? No, that was the point.
Yeah. No, that's, we heard some submissions on that. That's quite a crucial bit. Anyway, so you're saying that it's not really your area. One of the things, contracting, dispute resolution, this bill forever has this clause run off to the minister, which is sort of like a way of dealing with resolutions. Normally, if you look in a commercial setting, every time I've done an agreement like that, you normally have a process for arbitration or mediation. In some cases, it might be appropriate that you go to a court where it needs a commercial resolution. And heaven forbid, you wouldn't want, I'm sure Ian is a potential future racing minister or whatever, would be in a situation of pining on commercial operation. Yeah. But there may be occasions where it is appropriate to go to a minister, such as a jurisdictional matter.
Yes.
But what we've done in all these cases, it always goes to the minister, which board scrap, commercial scrap between DAB is wrong in my view. But I want to get your view on that, and whether we should be a bit more sophisticated in the way when we go to the minister and when we don't.
I agree with that, your view. Right. That you should be a bit more selective about that.
And we should enshrine a proper dispute mechanism.
Yes,
be clear about
I'm in agreement with that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, good. All right.
Okay. Are there any further questions?
Yeah. Yep. Just on the TAB board, where there's been some submissions and some thinking, would you put people directly from like the board, the co-chairs on that board, or would you think they need to go through some skills-based?
If the TAB is in fact owned, and I think that would be a wonderful decision to be made at some stage soon, if it's in fact owned by the industry, then I think it needs some representation. It doesn't necessarily have to be the code chair. It could be a representative of the code. It could be some business person that knows about trotting, right, and is, but is a commercial person or a lawyer or has other skills, yeah, that he can bring to the party. I don't think it necessarily has to be directly the chairman of the code necessarily at the TAB level, but it might be. But I think if it owns it, I think probably it's got to take some responsibility for it. And I think it'd be useful if you had 3 from the industry, or at least 2 from the racing industry. The rest of it should be skill based. And I would use a selection board. We have a system in New South Wales where, for example, I'm giving you that, there are other systems, but our system in New South Wales is the minister appoints 3 eminent people at arm's length from him, that quite often it's a very senior public servant. It could be someone like me, a retired chairman of one of the codes, et cetera, et cetera. And those people, along with the department, the minister's department, for want of any a better group, administers the selection process where they advertise the vacancies for the board. In the advertisement, it's very clear what the requirements are. They receive applications from far and wide. Often someone could get tapped on the back and say, this is something that you'd be good at, have a go, etc. But at the end of the day, they go through this selection board, and the ones that pass muster on paper get interviewed. And in the end, and all through that process, there's an integrity auditor to ensure there are no conflicts from within the selection group or with any of the applicants. And so there's an integrity auditor all the way through that process. And then the minister, in our case, the minister gets a list of, say, if there's 3 vacancies, he gets a list perhaps of 5 out of 25 applicants. These 5, we believe these 5 are qualified for the vacancies. It might only be 3 that come good, or it could be 5. If it's 5, then he can select, he gets an element of choice there. He can select 3 of the 5 if the numbers, we get 5 out of it. Otherwise, you might just get 3 to fill those spots. And then you send him a list of 3 and that's the list. So he still has a kind of a say, but he can only pick from the professional selection process that takes place under the eyes of an integrity auditor, arm's length, one of the, big public auditing houses.
So we have a similar, it's a college process we adopt. Normally in councils use it quite regularly. Yep. So that you're saying an independent process, skills driven. My first question, why does the minister have to have that oversight?
He doesn't have to have that oversight when you're redrafting the thing over here. It's a new ball game here now. So you can look at it and maybe he doesn't have to have that oversight.
Because essentially you're talking of all the industry. You're talking about the most commercial aspect.
Absolutely.
If we make it, the problem with this arrangement, if we make up contracting out the wage rate, the industry makes it up, we'll still be back here 5 years' time.
Yeah.
So you're, even to have a ministerial involvement in significant way,
it's not necessary.
Not necessary.
No. I gave you the example there.
Yeah.
Here, I suppose the 3 code representatives would be the arbiters of who does come on out of that. Would accept the recommendations of the selection group.
Okay. All right.
So I would think in the case of the TAB here, if it's owned by the industry.
And you might have 3 and 3 and 1 independent chair.
That could be the way you could do it. Yeah. Something like that would work.
Yeah. All right. Hey, thank you.
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Thank you very much for travelling all this way and giving the submission. It's obviously very valuable, and thank you for your efforts in this issue for us. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
I wish the best of luck to the industry. It's got to get back to where it was, because it was an absolute leader in the region, and it can get back to where it was. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, can we clear the room, please?